Hi there. My name is Allison Meyer. A little about me. I am a former high school social studies teacher who taught primarily in highly impacted schools from Chicago to Denver. Since leaving the classroom, I have had the incredible opportunity to learn about restorative justice practices from leaders of this work across our country. For many years, I served as the project manager of the Restorative Justice Partnership, a collaboration between Denver Public Schools, the Denver Classroom Teachers Association, the Denver-based community organization Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, the Colorado Education Association, and National Partners Advancement Project and the National Education Association. This groundbreaking collective of education stakeholders had a simple focus. How do we implement high-quality restorative practices in schools, and how do we share our learnings with others? Since then, I've served as the district coordinator of restorative practices for both Denver and Jefferson County Public Schools. So it is with those experiences and an immense amount of help from mentors along the way that I facilitate this learning today. In this video, we'll be discussing restorative justice practices and how they can serve as a tool for racial justice. Nationally, we are in the midst of a racial reckoning. In education, this means a renewed call for addressing the systemic racism present in our classrooms and in our schools. The data tells us that both nationally and here in Colorado, our students of color, our students experiencing poverty, our students with disabilities, and other marginalized groups are more likely to be suspended, expelled, and referred to law enforcement for the exact same behaviors as their peers. These punitive practices then further damage that student's relationship with their educators and their school, contributing to opportunity gaps in academics, extracurriculars, engagement, and more. You may have heard this disturbing trend referred to as the school-to-prison pipeline. Often a result of zero-tolerance policies, the school-to-prison pipeline is the practice of punishing and criminalizing young people for adolescent behaviors. By involving law enforcement, students are introduced into the criminal justice system, a system that we know is hard to escape, at a very young age. This might be a direct pipeline. For example, a student who is caught vandalizing school property is ticketed by a school resource officer and now has to make appearances in court and may graduate high school with a criminal record. This pipeline can also be less direct. A student's behavior might be interpreted as disrespectful by their teacher. They are then sent out of the classroom, perhaps even suspended, eroding their trust in our education system and contributing to disengagement at school. If this cycle repeats, which it often does, they may start to internalize the notion that I'm just a bad kid, which can have long-term implications on self-image and how the student sees their role in the community. These school experiences might breed suspicion towards a variety of social systems. So who is most likely to enter this pipeline? According to the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, Black students constitute 18% of students, but they account for more than 46% of those suspended more than once. From this same report, we know that students with disabilities are also more at risk. And then when we look at both race and disability status, it has been recorded that about 1 in 4 Black children with disabilities were suspended versus 1 in 11 white children with disabilities. Race continues to compound students' likelihood of entering into the school-to-prison pipeline. I would be remiss to not mention the student in the classroom who, while not an actual victim of these policies, witnesses how they are inflicted upon their peers. What are they learning as they observe who is perceived as safe and who is perceived as unsafe? Who is seen as good and who is seen as bad? What are they internalizing about how we treat one another? In addition to contributing to inequity, this one-size-fits-all nature of zero-tolerance policies often ignores the root cause of the behavior, as well as our responsibility as educators to approach challenging behavior and conflict as a learning opportunity. So ultimately, these policies have also been shown to be ineffective at actually changing behavior. For many of us, hearing about the school-to-prison pipeline is not new. In spaces designated for restorative practitioners, we often name that our purpose for doing this work is to address the disproportionality in school discipline. And yet, when we talk about the practices themselves, from circles to conferences, we are rarely explicit about how exactly these practices can address inequity. When we look at the data in districts across our country that have implemented restorative justice practices, we often discover that while suspensions, expulsions, and referrals to law enforcement decrease for all students, the disproportionate representation of students of color persists. So in other words, while less students are being suspended, students of color continue to be more likely to be suspended than their white peers. So this begs the question, what is missing from our restorative justice practices implementation? By their very nature, restorative justice practices should reduce racial inequities. The restorative approach asks us to give each behavior and conflict the individual attention it deserves. So practitioners should be taking into account how identity, power, and privilege are at play in any given interaction. However, what we often see in reality is that the biases of practitioners, folks in positions of power, and the education system itself instead continue to perpetuate these inequities even as the school implements a restorative approach. In order for restorative justice practices to actually be an effective tool for equity, educators must be intentional about how the practices are implemented. As practitioners, we are responsible not only for implementing with fidelity, but also with a race and identity conscious lens. So let's take a look at some examples of the most common restorative practices that we utilize in schools and see how they can be a tool for racial equity if implemented with that identity conscious lens. We will start with community building circles, a proactive restorative practice in which participants sit or stand in a circle and are each given the opportunity to respond to a common prompt or a common series of prompts. How are circles a tool for equity and inclusion? First, circles create a space for sharing perspectives across identities. Storytelling, and especially storytelling from voices that are traditionally marginalized, gives the individual the power to create their own narrative. Often, marginalized identities are viewed as a monolith, which leads to stereotyping and exacerbates the biases that folks from other and often more centered identities carry. By creating space for individuals to tell their stories, our appreciation for the complexity of racial identity and other aspects of identity can grow. Second, by honoring oral tradition and by valuing both the individual voice and the collective experience, circles are a culturally responsive practice. Zaretta Hammond, in her book Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, discusses 2 indicators of culture that educators should prioritize learning about their students. 1, whether the student comes from a culture that values oral tradition versus written tradition. And 2, whether the student comes from a culture that values individualism, that pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, or collectivism. We're all in this together. In our American education system, which was designed with Western and white culture in mind, we emphasize written tradition and individualism. Circles are a powerful way to honor the many cultures that are represented in our classrooms by elevating the oral tradition and the collectivism that is often ignored in our schools. When we are culturally responsive as educators, we allow our students, and particularly those from marginalized identities, to show up as their authentic selves. If you have a brain, you have bias. This is the reality of how the human brain operates. We both consciously and subconsciously think of the world in terms of affinity groups, those who are like me and those who are not. We then develop biases based on those affinity groups. When we feel connected to someone, we are less likely to act on those preconditioned biases and more likely to make more generous assumptions about them as an individual. There is evidence that suggests that these relationships can then start to alter our preconditioned biases. For example, as a white woman who has been socialized in this country, I have developed biases towards folks of different races. Through circles, and as I make connections with folks who belong to other racial identities and understand the complexity of their experiences, I am rewriting the neural pathways in my brain that are contributing to those biases. Last, but certainly not least, circles contribute to cultivating belonging. And when we feel connected, we are more likely to vocalize our needs when they are not being met. When I have a strong relationship with you, I feel less likely that giving you critical feedback will destroy it. And this culture of feedback is essential to creating and maintaining equitable spaces. In order to make sure we reap the benefits of community building circles, and particularly those equity-related benefits, we must be intentional and make some additional considerations about how we structure this sacred time together. Some of these questions might support you in starting that process. One question I encourage you to explore is, do my guidelines take into account how power and privilege might be operating in my space? Do they contribute to an environment where we can practice authentic listening? Sometimes educators fall into the trap of believing that circle guidelines are a way to make sure our class is under control during the circle. But participants being quiet when others are talking, for example, does not necessarily mean that our circle is contributing to an equitable learning environment. As an educator, I should be less concerned about control and more concerned about students, and particularly those from marginalized identities, being able to be their authentic selves. And I should be monitoring and checking in with students to ensure that they are really listening to one another. This could be systematized by adding a question at the end of each community building circle. What is one thing that you've learned about someone else during our time together today? Or it can be something I informally check in with students about. As practitioners navigating race and other aspects of identity, we also must consider how circles are inherently more burdensome for folks from marginalized identities. For myself in particular, as a white woman, I need to be aware that my lack of experience as a racially oppressed individual might contribute to me overlooking this burden. I have never experienced having my perspective seen as the perspective of all white people, for example. So I need to be very intentional that I honor this reality, which can ring true even when the circle prompt has nothing to do with race or identity. So what can I do? I can ensure that I have created avenues for folks from marginalized identities to give feedback, both to myself as a facilitator and to other participants in the circle. One way I've seen this accomplished is by establishing an ouch guideline, a way for folks to name, for example, when they are experiencing a microaggression, so that we can pause our circle and process as a group. I can be mindful about engaging in circles about identity and race before my community has demonstrated their ability to uphold our most basic guidelines when we are talking about more surface level topics. I can assure that there are affinity spaces set up following a circle. For example, after leading a circle on privilege and oppression, I can make certain that folks of color have a space to debrief their experiences without the presence of white folks. I can ensure that folks from marginalized identities are aware of prompts in advance, so they can choose what level of participation feels safe for them. Lastly, we should be consistently reviewing our prompts with a culturally responsive and trauma-informed lens. For example, following winter break, how often have we heard folks ask, what's one gift you received for Christmas? Or ask, what are you looking forward to for Thanksgiving in anticipation of the November break? These questions are neither culturally responsive nor trauma-informed, and they can contribute to further othering of participants that are from marginalized identities. As facilitators, we can seek to design prompts that have multiple entry points. What is one reason you're looking forward to being back at school? And then we can normalize voluntary participation so that students and adults alike can practice the self-protective strategy of passing if a prompt doesn't feel safe for them to respond to. This level of intentionality and continuous review of our facilitation practices is necessary for circles to have a meaningful impact on the way power and privilege are operating in our spaces. Next, let's discuss some responsive restorative practices and how we can be intentional to ensure that they actually reduce the well-documented impact adult bias has on student discipline. We'll begin with restorative conversations, which most typically are informal, reflective conversations between a student and an educator about a behavior or a conflict. However, these can also be conversations that happen student to student or adult to adult. At their best, restorative conversations can be a powerful tool for equity. By their very nature, they require adults to pause before reacting to a behavior and to hear the student's perspective and provide a more individualized and supportive response. It's important to remember, restorative conversations are not just learning conversations for the student. As the adult, I should be learning too. I should be expanding my perspective, practicing empathy for the young person, assessing possible root causes for their behavior, all of which is necessary before I respond if I am to be thoughtful. This slowing down, when coupled with training and reflection, can help adults recognize when we are acting on our biases and when we are intentionally making decisions. Through this dialogue, I hope that I can recognize why a certain behavior or a certain student might have been triggering to me. As I grow my own self-awareness, I hope to be able to identify where my own personal and cultural experiences are shaping the way in which I perceived this interaction. Rather than being escalated through a classroom management ladder, students are able to share their perspective in a restorative conversation and give feedback to the adult. And ultimately, this strengthens the relationship and the trust that we have. We work hard to build trust, and particularly with those outside of our affinity groups. And this restorative approach allows us to maintain those relationships and even strengthen them by seeking to understand one another's experiences. Strong relationships are one of the greatest mitigators to acting on our preconditioned biases. Finally, when we engage in a reflective conversation with the student has voice and has choice in determining the consequences for their behavior. By taking that power away from the adult and sharing it with the student, we can ensure that consequences are reasonable and logical and contribute to belonging instead of contributing to isolation. Yet, just as with circles, we have to be very intentional to make sure that restorative conversations are actually contributing to equity in our classrooms and spaces. That means providing coaching and feedback to evaluate if these practices are being implemented with fidelity. We should also be asking young people regularly if they feel heard when they engage in these dialogues, or if it just feels like a different way of being punished. There are some additional considerations that we can make around race and identity. Since these are conversations that are often in response to a student not meeting expectations, we have to ask, are our school and classroom rules and expectations culturally responsive? In other words, are they designed with more than the dominant culture in mind? So often we see school rules like dress code and attendance policies having clear biases towards white, cisgender, affluent students without disabilities. If that is the case in the space in which you operate, we will continue to have students of color and those from other marginalized identities overrepresented in school discipline, because in reality, the rules just weren't designed with them in mind. A simple way to navigate this is by ensuring that all students and their families have voice in designing classroom and school-wide expectations. When we empower young people to create the expectations, they are more likely to be reflective of their diverse experiences. Remember, restorative conversations are dialogues. They should be a two-way conversation. So are adults really listening to the student perspective? Are we encouraging young people to give us feedback on our own behavior? Are we taking ownership when we've messed up and making that concrete plan to make things right? If not, restorative conversations probably won't be the tool for equity that we desperately need them to be. For more challenging behaviors and conflicts, many school-based practitioners use formal conferencing and harm circles. These are our most formal restorative practices, in which a facilitator, after usually extensive preparation, brings together two or more parties in conflict with one another to engage in a reflective dialogue. While this process can still honor the intentions of our behavior, it emphasizes the impact the behavior has in our community and those individuals who are a part of it. "I didn't mean it like that" is a sentiment that can be incredibly inhibitive to racial healing. By prioritizing impact over intention, we can engage in conversations about how we contribute to inequity and inclusivity, even when we don't intend to. Most of the harms that humans cause in their interactions is unintentional, and yet we are still responsible for that harm. Once again, the perspective sharing that is so integral to restorative practices all along the continuum can serve to increase our understanding of identities that are different from our own. What an incredible concept to teach students and, to be honest, many adults. Two people can share an experience and walk away having a completely different understanding of what just happened. And we can then empathize with the experience and what that experience was like for the other person. From that more practical space, these formal practices can be a tool for equity in that they may be utilized as an alternative to punitive discipline practices, such as suspensions or referrals to law enforcement, which directly contribute to the school-to-prison pipeline and we know have a disproportionate impact on marginalized identities. So what additional considerations should we be making when we facilitate the most formal responsive practices to strengthen our race and identity-conscious lenses? Here are some questions that I usually ask myself as I prepare to facilitate a conference or a harm circle. As a facilitator, am I recognizing and exploring the underlying influence of race and other facets of identity on a given conflict? Particularly as a white facilitator, it can be easy to fall into the trap of colorblindness and see a conflict without recognizing the role that race is playing. Have I asked what healing looks like for a community member instead of inserting my own thoughts? Am I recognizing the role that my own identity is playing and how I approach this conflict and what I think should happen next? Am I mindful of perspective sharing and how that might be more burdensome for folks from marginalized identities? When a conflict is rooted in aspects of identity, which many conflicts are, the perspective sharing from the person with the centered identity can often be very defensive. As a facilitator, am I working with that person during their pre-conference to move past that defensiveness to sharing more authentically? Am I willing to call off the conference if we cannot move past victim blaming or insisting I didn't mean it that way? Often, folks from marginalized identities have shared with me that their own opportunity to tell their perspective feels like they are responsible for teaching the person from the centered identity about their oppression. How can I navigate this? As a facilitator, I can be mindful of who shares first, how long folks share for, and evidence of gaslighting and stonewalling as I bring folks together for dialogue. I can ensure that participants with marginalized identities are really clear on the process so they can opt out if it doesn't feel like it will be helpful or safe. I can have a plan for how they can excuse themselves from the conversation without the added burden of having to explain why. What other supports can I put in place in recognition of this imbalance of power? As a white facilitator, this might look like creating a space for a person of color to debrief with someone who shares that identity, to process how that felt with someone who they won't need to explain all the nuances to. And then I must guarantee that there is an avenue for them to provide me with feedback as a facilitator, should they choose to do so. Implementing these practices with fidelity is the first step to making certain that they actually contribute to equitable and inclusive learning environments. Oftentimes, grappling with the inequities of our education system can feel overwhelming. We might feel lost as to where to start in examining and refining our own practices to ensure that the way we implement restorative justice will actually be a tool for racial justice. Let's discuss some practical next steps. Be intentional in your implementation of restorative practices. Review your school or classroom policies with an anti-racist lens. Reflect on your implementation using some of the considerations that we just discussed. Conduct fidelity checks, being particularly mindful that we have not over-systematized restorative justice practices to the point of ineffectiveness. For example, have we turned restorative conversations into a reflection worksheet? Because then we are missing the perspective sharing and the collaborative nature of this practice that make it a tool for equity. Collect and analyze data that is disaggregated, especially by race, on a regular basis. This should be everything from suspension data to detention data to feedback surveys following conferences and circles. Look at school culture surveys disaggregated by race and other aspects of identity. And don't wait until the end of the year. Review it consistently so you can make adjustments and better serve students. Set intentional time for relationship building. There are competing priorities in schools, and don't let relationship building be what is pushed to the side. Build it into the schedule and model its importance by never neglecting it with staff. Ensure that you create both a culture of and systems for accountability and feedback, and then actually give one another feedback. This work is really messy, and we need to be able to identify areas of growth in one another. One of the easiest ways to address inequities in our schools is to elevate the voices of marginalized identities. Don't assume you know what your community needs. Rather, you should partner authentically with the young people and families that you serve and remove barriers so that they can be the ones to design the environment that meets their needs. Train students and community members to be the facilitators of these practices. In addition to being intentional in our implementation of the practices themselves, we must also be reflective on a personal level if we are going to implement with a race and identity conscious lens. Particularly for white practitioners, we have an obligation to read and reflect on the origins of restorative justice practices and recognize how this philosophy in many ways has been culturally appropriated as it is implemented into our schools. Be mindful of where we cut corners to fit restorative justice into our very white Western education system. Ensure that you and the students that you serve are exposed to both windows, or experiences that expose you to other cultures, and mirrors, or experiences that are reflective of your own culture. If you carry more centered identities, the world is already full of mirrors for you. So find windows. Read literature, listen to podcasts, watch movies, expand who you follow on social media. Hear from voices from cultures and identities that are outside of your own to expand your worldview. Then think about your curriculum. Is every student in your classroom or school exposed to both windows and mirrors? Dedicate time to reflect on your own personal and cultural experiences and grow your understanding of the lens through which you see the world. This work, which will take a lifetime, will increase your awareness of your own biases, making you more capable of recognizing them and preventing yourself from reacting to them. Lastly, learn deeply about the culture of the students and the families that you serve, and recognize that it is not their responsibility to teach you, but your own obligation to actively go out and learn. More than anything else, and especially if you are like me and a person who carries a lot of privilege, accept that you will make mistakes and both be open to and actively seek feedback from those who carry marginalized identities. As restorative justice practitioners, we need to recognize that our work is intertwined with equity work. We must couple restorative justice practices training with anti-racism work. If we leave out implicit bias work, for example, adult biases will continue to impact how student behavior is perceived and responded to, even as we implement restorative justice. If I attempt to create a restorative culture, but I have done nothing to create a culturally responsive environment, I will continue to have students and adults from marginalized identities that are feeling devalued and unheard and unseen. Likewise, if I am not trauma aware and trauma sensitive, the implementation of restorative justice practices might only perpetuate community members feeling unsafe, including those who belong to identities that have experienced generational trauma. Thank you for your time. May we continue to listen and learn so that restorative justice practices are a tool for anti-racism. The lives of our brothers and sisters depend on it.